Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to a brand new episode of Serial Saturday. If you're new here or just unaware, Serial Saturday is a series on Saturdays, shocker, where I talk about serial killers, who would have thought, and do my makeup. So if you're into any of that, maybe hit that subscribe button. I don't know. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious, killer couple, Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born October 1st, 1910 in Rowena, Texas. She is the second of three children to Charles Robert Parker and Emma Parker. Bonnie's father was a bricklayer who unfortunately died in 1914, thus forcing Emma and her three children to move back home with her parents in Cement City, which is apparently a suburb outside of Dallas. Basically, all through school, Bonnie was an honor student. That is until her second year of high school when she met Roy Thornton. The couple decided to drop out of school and they married on September 25th, 1926, 6 days before Bonnie's 16th birthday. But the marriage did not mean happily ever after for Bonnie. Unfortunately, Roy just could not seem to stay out of trouble. He was constantly in and out of jail, and in 1929, Roy was sentenced to 5 years in prison. And that was basically the end of their marriage, though the couple never officially divorced. And even more unfortunately for Bonnie, she had a tattoo above her knee that said Roy and Bonnie. So forever on her body is this reminder of her husband who she never sees. That sucks. That's just, don't get a tattoo with somebody else's name on it unless you're like related to them or they're dead. Just don't get your lover's name tattooed on you is the moral of this story. Meanwhile, Bonnie is moved back in with her mother and she gets a job as a waitress in Dallas. So in 1929, Bonnie is 18 years old and she's been keeping a journal, a diary, in which she wrote about her loneliness, her impatience with life in Dallas, and her love for taking pictures. Then, in January of 1930, Bonnie meets Clyde. Clyde Barrow was born March 24th, 1909, and he was born into a poor farming family in Tellico, Texas. He's the fifth of 7 children to Henry Barrow and Kumi Walker. The family moved to Dallas in the early 1920s, and they spent their first few months there living under a wagon until they had enough money to buy a tent. And there are 7 children in this family, so 9 people are living under a wagon. And then they lived in a tent, and that was like a step up. So I feel like it's probably pretty needless to say, but Clyde begins his life of crime at a very early age. His first arrest comes in late 1926 at the age of 17. He got arrested because he had a rental car and he did not return it. So his second arrest was with his brother Buck, and it was for possession of stolen turkeys. I mean, these are really great crimes. Like, honestly, the fact that you go from stealing turkeys and not returning rental cars to one of the most notorious crime sprees that's ever occurred, I mean, that's kind of impressive. You just have to give him that. It's a little bit impressive. Between 1927 and 1929, he really did some legitimate time, but while he was out, in his free time, he liked to crack safes, rob stores, and steal cars. You know, normal things. So then, like we already talked about, on January 5th, 1930, 20-year-old Clyde meets 19-year-old Bonnie. Sorry, if you see me, like, glancing a lot, it's because I got a microphone and I'm hoping it sounds better, but also it likes to stop recording every so often, so I'm very paranoid that we're getting to the time where it's just going to stop recording and I won't notice. So sorry if I'm like all over the place. Anyways, Bonnie and Clyde met through a mutual friend and they were immediately smitten. But their romance was interrupted in March when Clyde was arrested and convicted of auto theft. Honestly, the fact that Bonnie went through that marriage where she never saw her husband because he was always in and out of prison, the fact that that really just is what ended their marriage. And then she meets Clyde, and 2 months into this relationship, he's arrested. So instead of being like, boy, bye, I don't want to go through that again, she's like, I am in this for the long haul. What? In April 1930, Clyde is sent to the Eastham prison farm at the ripe age of 21. Although he did manage to escape shortly after his incarceration using a weapon that Bonnie smuggled to him. But he was recaptured shortly after and sent back to prison, where apparently he was repeatedly sexually assaulted. He retaliated by attacking and killing his tormentor, crushing his skull in half with a pipe, marking Clyde Barrow's first kill. But another inmate who was already serving life in prison claimed responsibility, so Clyde didn't have to deal with that at all. Then in 1932, Clyde decides in order to avoid doing hard labor in the fields, he should chop off a couple of his toes. Yes, you heard me correctly. So because he wanted to avoid a little bit of labor, he ended up walking with a limp for the rest of his life because he's missing a couple of toes. But unbeknownst to Clyde, while he's in prison chopping off his toes, his mom was on the outside begging for his release. And just 6 days after his little incident, he was set free. On February 2nd, 1932, Clyde is paroled, and his time has left him a bitter, hardened criminal. Naturally, with his newfound freedom, Clyde robbed grocery stores and gas stations. This time he did it with a fellow ex-con, Ralph Fultz, and Bonnie. Bonnie Parker was the third to make up this trio, because apparently that's what it is. The three of them together were known as the Barrow Gang. Their goal was to collect enough money and guns to launch a raid against, get this, East Ham Prison. Why? I don't know. That sounds like a terrific idea. They should definitely follow through with this, because what could go wrong, right? So all in all, the Barrow Gang was officially made up of Clyde's older brother, Marvin Buck Barrow, Buck's wife, Blanche, W.D. Jones, Henry Methvin, Raymond Hamilton, Joe Palmer, Ralph Fultz, and S.J. Watley. On April 19th of 1932, Bonnie and Ralph were captured in a failed hardware store robbery, in which they intended to steal firearms. But Bonnie was quickly released from jail after a grand jury failed to indict her. Ralph, on the other hand, was tried, convicted, and served time. He was smart and never rejoined the Barrow Gang. Then on April 30th, Clyde was the getaway driver in a Hillsborough robbery, during which the store owner, J.N. Buckner, was shot and killed. Unfortunately for Clyde, J.N.'s wife was able to identify Clyde from police photographs as one of the shooters, even though he actually stayed in the car the whole time. Meanwhile, jailbird Bonnie was writing poetry to pass the time. Eventually, she was released and her and Clyde reunited. Clearly, he is no good for you, girl. I mean, probably find you a man that doesn't like to spend most of his free time in jail. I mean, first her husband, now Clyde. She does not know how to pick them. Then on August 5th, Clyde, Raymond Hamilton, and Ross Dyer were drinking moonshine at a country dance in Stringtown, Oklahoma. Sheriff C.G. Maxwell and Deputy Eugene C. Moore made the mistake of approaching them in the parking lot. Clyde and Raymond opened fire, gravely wounding Sheriff Maxwell and killing Deputy Moore, making Moore the first law enforcement officer the Barrow Gang has killed, though eventually they will murder 9 of them. So another member of the Barrow Gang, W.D. Jones, has been a friend of the Barrows since childhood, and he joins Bonnie and Clyde on Christmas Eve, 1932, at the age of 16. The three of them left Dallas that night. On Christmas Day, while Clyde and W.D. attempted to steal a car from a young family man named Doyle Johnson, they ended up murdering him in his car in Temple, Texas. Clyde went on to kill Tarrant County Deputy Malcolm Davis on January 6, 1933, when he, Bonnie, and W.D. wandered into a police trap set for not them, but a different criminal. Unfortunately for police, it went very, very badly for them. And now the Barrow Gang has murdered 5 people since April. On March 22nd, 1933, Clyde's brother Buck was granted a full pardon and released from prison. He and his wife Blanche met up with Bonnie, Clyde, and W.D. in a temporary hideout at 47.5 Oak Ridge Drive in Joplin, Missouri. According to family sources, Buck and Blanche were just there to visit, supposedly attempting to persuade Clyde to surrender himself to law enforcement. According to neighbors, on the other hand, the group had a very loud loud, alcohol-fueled card games that ran late into the night in an otherwise quiet neighborhood. The men came and went at all hours, and Clyde even fired off an automatic rifle in the apartment while cleaning it. The neighbors never went directly to Bonnie and Clyde to ask them to be quiet, but one did report their suspicions about what was going on there to law enforcement. Police assembled a 5-man force on April 13th to confront what they suspected were bootleggers. Little did they know, they were not your ordinary bootleggers. The Barrow brothers and WD opened fire, killing Detective Harry L. McGinnis and fatally wounding Constable J.W. Harriman. Bonnie opened fire with a Browning automatic rifle while the rest of the gang fled, thus forcing Highway Patrol Sergeant G.B. Caller to duck behind a large oak tree. The .30 caliber bullets from the rifle struck the tree and forced splinters into the sergeant's face. Wounded, he can't stop Bonnie, so she jumps into the car with the men. They have to pull Blanche from the street because she's running down the street pursuing her dog, Snowball. It's this big gunfire showdown happening, and Blanche is worried about her dog. Surviving officers later testified that they only fired 14 rounds during the conflict. I missed this whole section of Face with Foundation. That's great. Let's see if we can't stretch this. One of the bullets hit WD and another struck Clyde, but it was deflected by his suit coal button, and a third bullet grazed Buck after ricocheting off a wall. While the gang escaped the police, they had to leave most of their possessions behind, including Buck's 3-week-old parole papers, a large arsenal of weapons, a handwritten poem by Bonnie, and probably the most damning thing they left behind was a camera with several rolls of undeveloped film. Naturally, police developed the film, and they found many photos of Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, and W.D. Jones posing and pointing weapons at each other. Police had the film developed at the Joplin Globe, so the Globe sent out Bonnie's poem and photos over the newswire. This included one photo that Bonnie particularly hated of her clenching a cigar between her teeth with a pistol in her hand. The Barrow Gang became front-page news across America. Over the next 3 months, the group traveled from Texas to Minnesota. They were just pretty much all over the place. In May, they tried to rob a bank in Lucerne, Indiana. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Then they did rob a bank in Okabena. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly either. Minnesota. Then while trying to steal a car in Louisiana, they ended up kidnapping Diller Darby and Sophia Stone. Just one of several instances where they kidnapped police officers or robbery victims. Usually they released their hostages far from their homes. Sometimes they would even give them money to help them return back home, which is like, you're already like on this massive killing spree. The fact that they are not just killing their hostages outright is pretty strange, I would say. I don't know. I just think it's weird. Like, so apparently the Barrow Gang only kills if they feel that their lives are also being threatened. That's what I get from that, because otherwise you would think that they would just kill everybody that they encounter who, like, they want their things, you know? Apparently not. Stories about their sprees continued to make headlines, and with their new notoriety, obviously their daily lives became a lot more difficult. Their pictures have been plastered all over the newspapers, so they can't just go out and people don't know who they are. Basically, everyone knows who the Barrow Gang is at this point. On June 10th, Clyde was driving with W.D. Jones and Bonnie near Wellington, Texas, when Clyde failed to see warning signs for a bridge under construction. The car flipped into a ravine, and sources would disagree on whether there was actually a gasoline fire or if Bonnie was doused with acid from the car's battery under the floorboards, but she wound up sustaining third-degree burns to her right leg. It was so severe that the muscles contracted and caused the leg to draw up. In fact, she was burned so bad that no one thought she was going to live. She could hardly walk. She either hopped or Clyde carried her. The gang got help from a nearby farm family, and then they kidnapped Collinsworth County Sheriff George Corey and City Marshal Paul Hardy, leaving the two of them handcuffed and barbed wired to a tree outside of Eric, Oklahoma. Sounds like them. The gang then hid out in Fort Smith, Arkansas, in a tourist court in order to try to nurse Bonnie's wounds. That is until Buck and WD bungled a robbery and murdered the town marshal in Alma, Arkansas. Then in July 1933, the gang checked into the Red Crown Tourist Court south of Platte City, Missouri. This is where they began to make mistakes, even more so than before. Blanche registered their party as 3 guests, but the owner, Neil Hauser, could clearly see 5 people get out of the car. He also noted that the driver backed into the garage gangster style for a quick getaway. Blanche paid for their cabins with coins rather than bills, and did the same later when buying 5 dinners and 5 beers. The day after their arrival, Neil noticed that his new guests had plastered newspaper over the windows of their cabin. Then again, Blanche paid for 5 meals with coins. So Neil informed Highway Patrol Captain William Baxter of his new guests. Meanwhile, Clyde and W.D. Jones head to town to buy crackers, cheese, bandages, and atropine sulfate to treat Bonnie's leg. The salesperson contacted Sheriff Holt Coffey, who put the cabins under surveillance. So it turns out that Sheriff Coffey had already been alerted to be on the lookout for anyone buying these kinds of supplies by Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas law enforcement officers. Reinforcements were called in from Kansas City, including an armored car, and the group of law enforcement officers made their way towards the cabins at 11 p.m., armed with Thompson submachine guns. A gunfight ensued, and the .45 caliber Thompsons proved no match for Clyde's .30 caliber Browning automatic rifle, which he had stolen on July 7th from the National Guard in Enid, Oklahoma. The gang managed to escape when a bullet short-circuited the horn in the armored car, and officers mistook it as a ceasefire. They did not pursue the fleeing Barrow car. So once again, they have managed to escape law enforcement, but once again, not without repercussions. Buck sustained a bullet wound that blasted a large hole in his forehead skull bone and exposed his injured brain, while Blanche was nearly blinded by glass fragments in both her eyes. On July 24th, they set up camp in Dexter, Iowa, at an abandoned amusement park. Buck was semi-conscious and even talked and ate, but it was clear to the gang that he was not going to survive. Not only does he have this massive head wound, but he's also lost a lot of blood. So Clyde and WD dug a grave for him. Local residents noticed their bloody bandages and notified police, who were able to determine that the campers was in fact the Barrow Gang. Local officers and approximately 100 spectators surrounded the gang, and the Barrows soon came under fire. Clyde, Bonnie, and WD escaped on foot, while Buck was shot in the back, and he and his wife were captured by police. Ultimately, Buck died of his head wound and pneumonia after surgery 5 days later at King's Daughters Hospital in Perry, Iowa. For the next 6 weeks, the remaining members of the gang traveled to Colorado, Minnesota, and Mississippi, continuing to commit armed robberies. They restocked their arsenal when Clyde and WD robbed an armory in Platteville, Illinois on August 20th, acquiring 3 bars, Browning automatic rifles, handguns, and a large quantity of ammunition. Early in September, the gang risked a run to Dallas to see their families, and it was at this time that WD opted to part ways with the Barrows. He said, I think I've had enough fun, so you guys just go on without me. We're good. WD went on to Houston, where his mother had moved, and he was arrested there without incident on November 16th. Okay, I had issues, and clearly it's not the same day anymore because my hair looks way different, and I really just didn't feel like refilming this video for the 3rd time, so I'm just gonna pick up right here and finish out the story because we don't have very much left. So, throughout the fall of 1933, Clyde continued committing robberies, this time with small-time local accomplices, while his family and Bonnie's attended to her wounds. Then on November 22nd, Clyde narrowly evades arrest while trying to meet up with some family members near Sowers, Texas. Little does he know, 3 cops are laying nearby waiting for Clyde to show up. So Clyde drives up, but he just gets this feeling that it's a trap. So he sees his family, but he just keeps driving. And Just as he drives past the cops, they jump up from their hiding position and start shooting at the car. Fortunately for his family members, they were not harmed in the crossfire, but a bullet did pass through Bonnie and Clyde's car, striking both of them in the leg. The couple managed to escape the area later that night. Then on November 28th, a Dallas grand jury delivered a murder indictment against Bonnie and Clyde for the killing of Tarrant County Deputy Malcolm Davis, which happened nearly 10 months earlier. This would mark Bonnie's first murder warrant. Then on January 16th, 1934, Clyde orchestrated the East Ham breakout. During this breakout, several prisoners escaped, including Old Barrow gang members Raymond Hamilton and Henry Methvin. One of the present gang members, Joe Palmer, ended up shooting Major Joe Crossan, who died a few days later. This attack attracted the full power of the Texas and federal government. So now, everybody is looking for Bonnie and Clyde. The Texas Department of Corrections contacted former Texas Ranger Captain Frank Hammer and persuaded him to join in on the hunt for Bonnie and Clyde. Even though he was retired, he accepted the assignment. Then on April 1st, 1934, Easter Sunday, Clyde and Henry Methvin killed two highway patrolmen at the intersection of Route 114 and Dove Road, near Grapevine, Texas. An eyewitness would later recall that Bonnie and Clyde fired the fatal shots, and this story received widespread coverage. But this eyewitness kind of was giving different accounts of what happened in each interview he gave and each story he told. And Henry Methvin would later admit that he was the one who actually started the shooting because he thought he got a signal from Clyde. Clyde just ended up going along with it because that's what they do, right? And because the eyewitness's story was ever changing, it was later discredited. But not before the massive negative publicity increased the public clamor for the extermination of Bonnie and Clyde. A $1,000 reward for, quote, the dead bodies of the Grapevine Slayers was offered, not just for their capture, for their bodies. They don't want them alive. They want them dead. And then another $500 reward was offered for each of the two killers. 5 days later, public hostility increased. Surprisingly, it could get worse when Clyde and Henry murdered 60-year-old Constable William Campbell in Oklahoma. Then on May 23rd, 1934, Bonnie and Clyde's story came to an end on a rural road in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Frank Hammer, who had been tracking them since February, led the posse that took Bonnie and Clyde down. He'd been studying the gang's movements and found that they just kind of went in a circle, skirting the edges of 5 Midwestern states, thus exploiting the state line rule, where if you commit a crime in one jurisdiction, police cannot come after you once you cross jurisdictional boundaries. Unfortunately for Clyde, he was so consistent in his movements that Frank Hammer was able to chart a path and predict where Bonnie and Clyde were ultimately going to go. He found that their itinerary really just centered on family, and he knew that they were due to see Henry Methvin's family in Louisiana. So, Clyde had designated Henry's parents' house as their rendezvous point in case that the gang was split up. Henry ended up separating from the group in Shreveport, Louisiana, so it was just Bonnie and Clyde at this point. And a few days before the ambush, Frank Hammer and his posse were in Shreveport, where they learned Bonnie and Clyde were planning on visiting that evening. They were able to set up an ambush along Louisiana State Highway 154. At approximately 9:15 a.m. on May 23rd, the posse was concealed by bushes and other brush and just about to give up. They had been laying in wait for nearly 2 days, for about a day and a half at this point. And just when they're about to give up, they hear the Ford V8 Clyde was driving, rumbling down the road at a high speed. Police had persuaded one of Henry Methvin's family members to position his truck along the shoulder of the road in hopes that Clyde would stop to speak with him. Luckily for them, Clyde fell for the trap, and the lawmen opened fire on their vehicle before it even stopped moving. Clyde Barrow was killed instantly by a headshot. Ultimately, officers fired nearly 130 rounds of ammunition, emptying their weapons into the car. And that is the Bonnie and Clyde story. I really think that the gang just kind of knew, at least Bonnie and Clyde for sure, they had to have known that the only way out of this was either completely disappear, change your identities, which they did not have the money for, am I right? Or they were just going to end up dead, and they definitely ended up dead. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what you think about the story, who else you'd like for me to talk about next or in the future. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!